Okay, let's chat with James and Luke.
So welcome to the next episode of the podcast Let's Chat, brought to you by Property and Poppadoms. I'm James Rogers and I am the founder of Property and Poppadoms, which is the fastest growing property networking event in the UK. And we have an absolute titan of a guest on today, don't we?
We do indeed, yes. We won't introduce him just yet, though.
No.
First of all, we want to introduce our sponsors, don't we? I'm going to start with Blue Bricks, which I think is one of the best UK magazines for property. And I know what you're thinking, why would I want to buy a magazine? But guess what? You can keep doom scrolling through your YouTube and looking for all of the property tips that you can get. It'll take you hours and you'll end up looking at cats anyway. So why not get one of the best property magazines? They'll even give you a free edition so you can check it out and get all of your intelligent news right to your mailbox. When you need it, read that, you're good to go. Who else, James?
So next up, we have 978 Finance. So 978 Finance provide funding options to property investors and developers. And they're currently funding anything and everything from bridging loans to buy-to-lets, to buy, refurb, refinance, up to large portfolio purchases.
Yeah, and once you've got your finance, you want to find your next property. And there's no better way than using PropTech to make sure that you are in the know with the right data. And my favourite is Property Filter. Absolutely fantastic setup. And you can get a free trial as well for 2 weeks. Check it out if you're not using Property Tech in your property journey. It is a game changer. Who else, James?
It is. And finally, last but by no means least, we have the Optimised Entrepreneur. So they are helping keep you entrepreneurs fit, healthy, motivated, and able to perform at your highest level, which is obviously needed within this industry.
Totally. If you are going to have a successful business, any business, let alone a property business, you need health as your foundation, because health is your real wealth. You know, they say that a rich man has many, they say a healthy person has many dreams, an unhealthy person has only one: good health. So check them out, because if you want to improve your health for this year, they are a goldmine. James, let's let the cat out of the bag.
I know. Well, they say never meet your idols. I disagree. So we've got Adam Lawrence on today. So for those of you who aren't familiar with who he is, he's a large portfolio landlord, one of probably the most talented investor I've ever met. He also writes a weekly article called The Sunday Supplement. He also has a YouTube channel called Propenomix. Those two resources are huge educational resources, so I'd really implore you to check those out. I've been a great fan for many years now and following you, Adam. Not literally, just online.
I've caught you occasionally peeking around the odd corner, James.
Peeping out the bushes there, But welcome, mate. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for the intro. I always feel the blushes just go up as these intros get better, and I find myself looking over my shoulder for someone else who's going to be in here, but I appreciate the kind words anyway. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So today we're going to discuss opportunities for 2025 and what that might look like within our industry.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, we've got a bit of a year ahead of us, haven't we?
Yeah.
And we've had a pretty mixed start to it. Not quite as mixed as if we'd been in the US, as we were talking about before we started this podcast. But we started with this sort of very gloomy. I think Labour have got to take responsibility for that. They came into government being gloomy, pretty classic politics to blame the other side. I feel like we all got the message months ago, but they carried on with all of that. I also feel like the country voted the way it did because it knew that. It didn't really need reminding. It was sick to the back teeth of the Conservative Party and gave them a huge boot. So I don't know that we needed all of that. But then we had this incredible, miserable speech from Starmer and from Rachel Reeves beginning of September saying how terrible this budget was going to be and all the rest of it, and that created a huge amount of opportunity in the market, and they carried on being glum. And I'm an economist by education, by training. I don't work in economics, but as you said, I do write a piece once a week. I'd probably write more about economics than most people who are professional economists, I'd imagine. And it was just all doom and gloom and doom and gloom. And there is this concept of animal spirits. John Maynard Keynes called it. Boosterism was made more famous by Boris Johnson. And the point is, if you talk things up, you might well get people to be happy, invest money, take risk, and all the rest of it. And of course, we had the complete reverse of that with the budget, because anybody who employs people is looking at things going, well, cost of people's going up. So what am I going to do? Am I going to make less money? Am I going to try harder? Am I going to sack people and get tech in to do their jobs? That's basically the choices that you've got. And it was all misery, 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 which unfortunately created a lot of opportunity. We had this huge disposal of assets because people were panicking about capital gains tax. No real substance behind that, to be honest. But they did. And this huge disposal, September, October, which I was a significant beneficiary, if I'm honest with you. But I can't control the macroeconomy. I can only seek to try and understand it. And then just suddenly in the last few weeks, as we've started the year, we've had a sudden change. Someone's tapped Rachel Reeves on the shoulder and said, this isn't good. We aren't going to get investment. We're not going to get the economy moving unless you're positive about things. And suddenly, complete volte-face. How do you prove you're serious about growth? Well, you trash your net zero objectives, which is what they've done effectively in the last few weeks. Heathrow, new runway, etc., etc. Already passed, of course, in 2018. And huge, big picture projects, none of which will happen this Parliament in reality, but it's getting people thinking and moving. And we know the one thing that I think the property community would roundly agree on is planning being liberated, if you like, whether it's going far enough. But Reeves actually said in her speech the other day she doesn't want developers worrying about bats and newts. Quite aggressive, anti-green chat anyway, really. Certainly had some criticism from the far left on that sort of stuff. And if you can get those blockers out the way, and they're talking about, revamping the Section 106 and making sure that, because this is £100 million bat shed for HS2, it takes something like this sometimes to capture the imagination of the parliamentarians who don't worry too much about spending £1 million here or there. But 100 million doesn't look good, does it?
No, but I pick up there. You use the word opportunity a lot within your description of the current climate. Now, you use the word panic as well, but that's what this government created within our industry.
Yeah.
And obviously, like you say, you can only try and understand the macroeconomic situation, and you were a beneficiary of that. Yeah. But that has created significant panic within our industry for, let's call them hobby landlords and not maybe the professional astute investors like yourself.
I think that's absolutely spot on. And I think the problems that you've got include, they're ideologically opposed to the private rental sector at the top level of this government, right? They don't think they need it. They think it only exists because the social sector has let everybody down so much, which I don't think is necessarily wrong, although there is that inconvenience of the fact that quite a lot of renters prefer to rent. They're not all handcuffed into awful contracts. There's choice, there's flexibility. And as frictional costs, including stamp duty, have gone up and up and up and up and up because the thresholds are frozen, but the house prices keep going up and all the rest of it, then it doesn't make sense to spend. The average house price transaction from the 1st of April this year will attract 3.6% in stamp duty. Now, you pay that day one. It's gone. If you sell the house tomorrow, you've still paid it and you can't claw it back. You can't expense it against anything. As a company, it goes on your balance sheet. If you're an investment company, sure. But I mean, private individuals who do most of the transactions is where they're stuck. So they don't really care about the private rental sector, which I then interpret as they don't really care about the tenant. Right? Because it's the tenant who misses out in these situations, unfortunately.
It's the bottom. I try and choose my words carefully. Not that I'm a tenant myself, but it's the bottom, the people at the bottom that suffer the most.
Look, the average tenant in this country has a household income of 34k. The average homeowner has got the average income of 60k. Yeah. Right, that's the brutal reality of the numbers. You can take a position on how fair or unfair any of that is, but that tells you roughly where you need to be. But as I say, there is still a decent slice of the sector who want flexibility. It's not everybody, and you can have a very Westminster view of this, can't you? If you try and rent a property in Westminster and it's upwards of £2,000 a month, and it just seems ridiculous. And whilst everyone's getting squeezed with frozen income tax threshold bands, what do you need to earn before tax before you bring home that you might be on a nice 60k salary in London, which would be enough to buy a house from what I've just said, but your marginal 10 grand is being taxed at 42%, plus all the rest of the thresholds that you start to lose and other benefits you might start to lose and all the rest of it. And it causes a problem. And these problems just sort of creep over time. This is what inflation does to an economy, especially when you need, or you've got a party in power that feels that you need higher taxes. But of course, that's what Conservatives felt. That's what Labour feel. And going back to the social housing point, it's all very well saying it, but you've got to deliver it. And the problem is you just need a huge amount of money. Your average housing association is needing a grant of 150 grand in order to put in to build one social home. That's the average they're running at. And that's going up and up because although Labour are saying about cutting regulations, Building Safety Act, obviously nothing to do with them, came in when the Conservatives were in power, but it's added build cost to things. So you've got problems in planning that are legacy problems, which is slowing down delivery. You have a market like 2023 where prices go down and developers stop building so much. Very, very clever at constricting the supply. So they have to manage the price of their new builds. So although the secondary market went down in 2023, new builds actually sold for more money because they just create a lot of scarcity. But of course, when you're creating scarcity, you push your pipeline back. And so you don't do as many starts. And then you don't do as many planning applications. So fewer applications, fewer starts leads to fewer completions 2025, 2026. And that's a mathematical certainty because the process is not fast and it won't suddenly get fast because you reform planning, which won't really be a true massive reform. It's going to be a really decent tweak. But
lot to think about there. One of the things you said back there, though, made me think, because I grew up in the 70s and the 80s, an Englishman's home is his castle. And I think in the UK, we have a culture of aspiring to own our own homes. And I think it's the rental sector has always been a little bit undermined. And I grew up where there was a lot of council houses, a lot less now, obviously. And I think that people aspire to have their own homes, but there's a lot of particularly younger people who want that mobility and want that choice. And I remember if you were renting when I was growing up, they were not great quality, but there's so much good quality in the market now. Actually, and we see some really big, investors. Grant Cardone, I would take as one in the US, who just comes to mind, rents his home because people want to tie their money into investments and into life and into experiences. So actually, do you see the long-term rental market actually continuing to grow because of these kind of economic macro trends?
That's a really good question. And I think what I like there as well is that this is what the government should do. They should talk about the rental market, not the private rental sector versus the social sector. There's a rental market and there always will be. And there's some very good ideas out there about rents that transition as your household income goes up. The reality is over time, if you draw a graph of people's ages from 16 when they might go to work or 18 or whatever these days, all the way through to 65 plus, you see, generally speaking, people earn less when they're younger. It goes up. It peaks when they're about 55. This is aggregating the whole population together. And then it starts to tail off a bit because at 55, perhaps the kids have grown up. They don't need so much disposable income. The mortgage is smaller. Still 2/3 of people own a property in this country, and that's going up, not down. But you wouldn't believe that if you listen to the press narratives around all of this sort of stuff. So think about it as the rental sector as the first port of call. If you want to rebalance social versus private, accept that that's a relatively long project, but don't scare people, tax people out of existence, vilify them. We're talking about miserable communications. Look at what landlords have had to deal with over the last 10 years to encourage them. Hobby landlords, I think is the correct way of referring to them, as you did earlier, James. But ultimately, the most common number of properties that a landlord owns in this country is 1. The second most common is 2. And the third most common is 3. Not, generally speaking, people like me. So if you scare all of those people off all in one go, last year we know from Rightmove and Zoopla saying roughly 1 in every 5 properties that came to market was rented in the last 5 years, right? But only 1 in 10 that was bought for let. So you've got a rate of disposal, or certainly being offered to the market, at double the rate of new stock. And you've got increasing population. You've got a growing rental sector because you've got, this demographic shift. You've also got older people renting who haven't necessarily bought, who were in the rental market but maybe missed the right to buy was a fantastic piece of wealth transfer, not on its own something to necessarily be opposed, although a bit of a lottery ticket if you had a flat in London, you could then sell for £1 million, right? But then, there's always going to be some fairness and some unfairness. But the problem was not reinvesting the receipts of right to buy. And it's not political, because it didn't happen under Thatcher. It didn't happen under Major. It didn't happen under Blair. It didn't happen under Brown. And it didn't happen under Cameron. And then those idiots afterwards, I can barely say their names, to be honest. Although I do like Mr. Sunak, but not as a Prime Minister.
So do you see then that these trends are creating consolidation in private landlords as we're moving to people more at your end of the spectrum who have got these larger portfolios?
Yeah, I think that was the intention from 2015. George Osborne, he was working towards a seat on the board at BlackRock or whatever. It wasn't really a fluke that he would favour institutional investment. Renters' Rights Bill, Reeves and Starmer are the same as Cameron and Osborne in many ways, to be honest. But in terms of thinking that big business will provide the answer. But I think the biggest problem is at the governmental level, people don't understand transition between all of these fractured hobby landlords and then people like me or much bigger institutions than me, the Patrizias of the world. I mean, get your head around Patrizia in, I think it was 2022, did 10% of all of the transactions in Germany on their own. 60 billion balance sheet at the time, serious organisation, but 10% of all the transactions in one country. The US, Germany, million miles ahead of us in institutional ownership. Stigma you talked about earlier, Luke, in terms of growing up and stigma, very little stigma. But moving to a property in Germany, you bring your own kitchen. Average length of tenancy, 10 years. Because it's where you work, it's where you live. Whether you're deciding, I have a few different thoughts on whether you should own your own home or not, and I'm worried about comparing the US to the UK sometimes because it's our last bastion of tax relief on property apart from anything else. So there's very good, I prefer, own your own, use equity release when you get to an age when you can use it. That for me is the optimal strategy, but that's my own personal estate planning. But I do think it's a good idea from a tax efficiency perspective. But you've got these huge institutions. How do we get from, and of course what happened again that no one was really in control of, was the interest rate normalisation piece that happened between late 2021 and sort of 2023, mid-23, late 23. What that meant was, in the old days, especially in 21, when the bond yields were basically nothing, your Legal and Generals of the world, or your Lloyds, or your Avivas, or whoever, looked at a project and said, well, that returns 3% build to rent, right? Now, most of us would look at that and go, well, that can't work. We use mortgages, so how would 3% work? But they're not. They're allocating huge amounts of capital. And of course, it's not just 3% because rents go up with inflation. So you've got inflation protection and then you've got capital growth. So the returns are acceptable. But when you suddenly go to a world where limited company portfolio holders are paying 6% on debt and those big institutions can get 5.5% on a government bond, on a 30-year government bond, well, what return do they need to make it worth the time, the effort and the risk?
It's just always a numbers game, isn't it? It is anyway, but certainly
at that level, they're paying people smarter than me to do their numbers, right? And they're saying, well, the margin between 3% when bond returns are 0 and then when bond returns are 5, they're not getting 8% on their build to rents. Do you know what I mean?
So why would you bother?
Well, they haven't, and this is evidenced by what, and that's why that side's collapsed. So you can. And you've seen this with Reeves and Starmer. I would use the word seduce. They're trying to seduce these companies in, which on the one side then they've been putting their taxes up, which doesn't help. But they have said no more of that. We may be sceptical, but there'll be a big statement in March, at the end of March, which will prove or disprove. I don't think blaming the black holes and the Tories and all that is going to wash anymore. So we'll see something a bit different from Reeves. But I think we might see something somewhat aggressive, which won't be a bad thing necessarily.
No, and I mean, in terms of, I'd like to touch on, obviously you've mentioned social housing, and that has been a huge, I've seen an uptick of that, certainly from a funding perspective, from people that are talking about it as a strategy as a whole. And would you say that is a real opportunity for 2025?
Well, you said earlier on, didn't you, that I used the word opportunity, and I do see these things as opportunities. It's not just me being a glass half full, eternal, annoying optimist or whatever. It's absolutely an opportunity. And I think while we're on that subject, very clearly we should say to people, lending your money into rent-to-rent providers who are promising social housing returns, but you don't actually own any assets and you've got no security. I said at the beginning of this trend, don't do it. It's going to blow up. It's going to be awful. Unfortunately, and so did a number of other people in the property space, none of the influential people. Unfortunately, there's still been mega losses that we're currently seeing, and we'll see some more of over the next few months in terms of these are sort of fresh air contracts, but people are promised 15 and 20% returns and things like that. So set that aside because that's polluting what social housing should be. What you are seeing is an opportunity created by many more people needing temporary accommodation. I very much dislike the categorisation of people in temporary accommodation as homeless. I think it's disingenuous and I think it's inaccurate and I don't think it solves the problem. But within TA, there are huge differences between a family that are allocated to a flea pit B&B with damp and mould all the way up the walls and all the rest of it, and people who are in a housed temporary accommodation house where they're on a waiting list. I saw an article this morning, Bristol, 4-bed waiting list, 200 years. So if you're in a 4-bed house in Bristol, but on a TA rate, paid for by the council, you're not moving, are you? That sounds pretty permanent to me.
Yeah.
And this is a whole new strata of the tenancy system that is growing at, and I mean, go and look at the figures, but over 30% growth year on year. Of course, some of it driven by cost of living. Absolutely. Unfortunate. But ultimately, again, how do you react to what the macro market is doing? I feel much better about providing a home that I can lease to a good temporary accommodation provider than I do about one more PRS property, because that just feels like a pebble in the pond. Whereas to make a difference, to provide them with a good product, but of course on the flip side of that, anyone in a TA situation who's provided a great product, they're not going to have much incentive to try and move either. So it's difficult because I strongly believe people behave as they're incentivised. But huge growth area. Lenders are a bit slow. Would love us to talk to a few lenders about how they need to look at these contracts and why they're much more secure, especially in an age of renters' rights, which I'm sure we'll get onto, but it's changing the attractiveness and the risk and the effort may be needed and the perception in private sector landlords. I think you're going to see lots and lots more people look at lease-back arrangements to councils. I think councils will start to pick those up a bit more. Maybe disposal arrangements with councils. We get some letters from some local authorities where we've got some ex-local authority property. We've got a couple from one council up in Scotland at the moment. They're looking at buying back a couple of houses, right? They come back at full market price. It's not really full market price, but it's acceptable normally. So, and it's good that, and they at the moment they only bring stock back in that they built themselves, which you can understand because it kind of ensures build quality. But there's a pretty easy way around that sort of thing. I think it's called a survey from a Rick surveyor. But listen, you know, I think they're gonna need to do this sort of stuff on a bigger level than they do at the moment, whether it's leasing back, whether it's buying back. And there's a good economic case for it, because if you push people into temporary, the cost is huge. And you can see how much temporary and social care are absolutely mullering council budgets around the country. We are swamped with headlines these days of council tax, you know, legislated to only go up 4.99% without either going to the Secretary of State or having a referendum or, you know, broader action. And you've got people, I think in Bridgewater, council tax is going up 35% this year. These local authorities are in really, really bad financial state, which is a bit of a problem for Labour because they want to devolve more power to local government, which might work, might not, depends how competent the people are who things are devolved to, and that's where your problem starts. But we do have a very centralised Westminster-style system, and that doesn't work for Newcastle or Nottingham or somewhere in Cumbria. You know, it doesn't make any sense. So if it's done well, it can work. My fear is, will it be done well?
It's like with anything, and it's like a touch on your rent-to-rent comment, and you know, and the losses that will and are happening.
Yeah.
You know, it's not done properly.
No,
it's on a whim. We will guarantee you a huge return, and it's just fresh air, like you say. Anything done properly and done correctly will be done properly and correctly.
Yeah.
So the situation with that, and in terms of your point on the funding of it as well, I do think personally the lenders will start to relax and more will enter the marketplace. So there will be a little bit more flexibility around those leases, around those contracts, and the ability to enter into that market space for investors.
Yeah, I strongly agree with that. I remember showing one of these leases. So I got told I must be about 2014, I showed this lease to a broker who was quite a high-profile broker at the time. The same broker who told me I was an idiot for buying stuff in limited companies. This is obviously before Section 24, because you don't do it that way. You don't do it that way. You might do flips like that, but you do holding stuff in your personal name. And I explained what my overarching strategy was. I wanted to build a big portfolio. I'm not going to raise that kind of debt in my own personal name.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen, right? But she sort of dismissed all of that and then told me I'd never get a mortgage against one of these. And I showed her the mortgage works at the time, terms and conditions, and said, this lease that I've read, and you haven't, fits within these terms and conditions that are here. And she said, no, it doesn't. I said, well, it does. It has. Look, go and send it to a lawyer if you want to, but it does. And so there's already financing available for it. Mortgage works have messed around a bit since then. Yeah. But the point was, even in a time where lending was quite restricted compared to what it is today, 10, 11 years further on, there was funding, and there'll always be funding. It's changed a lot. I've been doing it 11 years now. It has changed a lot, and it's been quite minority. But I remember showing it to a commercial banker once, someone who worked for Handelsbanken, and he said, these are great. What a great arrangement. Give us some more of these. I said, thanks, I'm trying. But he loved it. And any people with commercial banking experience look at these leases and go, brilliant arrangement. What affects your returns when you're a landlord ultimately? Voids, arrears. You're taking these problems out with one of these leases, potential damage. Again, problem taken away. You have got a commercial lease within a residential property investment, and that to me is the greatest hybrid possible in property. So that's how near evangelical I am about them. On the flip side, what I wouldn't want you to go and do is listen to this podcast and build a portfolio of 30 houses that all look the same in the same town that all went to Serco. Because then you're building a complete dependency on Serco. So they still have to work as single lets, as a
about
backstop.
Managing your risk as well. Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
100% agree.
So lots of great information there about where we are politically, economically. So for listeners of the podcast who are thinking, great, Adam, love all of that, but what are you going to do, and what should I be doing or thinking about to optimize all of these situations, and where should I be investing my money and my time to get the best return in 25?
The killer question, so what? Absolutely, love it. So you can't just sit around and wait for things like Rachel Reeves' 2024 budget to happen. The point is you put yourself in a position to be able to transact when they do happen. Right, so even with a big portfolio, we still buy individual properties. Bread and butter, keeps the wheels moving. Lots and lots of, so multiple connections in order to do that. But in terms of like seismic events for this year, if you like, we know we've got this reintroduction of stamp duty on 31st of March, 1st of April, between the 125 and 250k threshold. That will cause transactions to fall over. So early April, I can guarantee it, there'll be chain breaks there to be swept up, where you might well be able to save more than you would have paid in February or March, because people will want the chains to complete. There's also, depending on what you're doing with the property, potential stamp duty exemptions on getting involved in chain breaks if you've got a property trading company. So that would be the first one.
Okay.
Then we've got the speculation around renters' rights. Second reading in the Lords yesterday went through as we're recording this. So then the process is third reading, Commons, Lords, again, committees, blah, 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 royal assent. So we're not a million miles away. April, May, it feels like May-ish to me, but I'm basing that on what a few of the more niche experts say about renters' rights. Massive problem for student landlords because risk is going up hugely, because there's going to create this two-tier system. Purpose-built student can use a 12-month AST. HMO, standard student landlord. Not normally hobbyist, to be fair, because it's not an accidental thing, owning student property. But what does your typical student landlord look like? Half a dozen properties. They'd fit in that range. Got all that dependency risk. They're all in Clifton. If they are, they've got a few quid, so well done. They're all in wherever. They're all in Forest Fields. They're all in wherever around the country. So that will lead to them needing or wanting to repurpose them, to find other ways of managing their risk. Maybe some of them will go into the social sector. Maybe some of them will go into the professional sector. So then that creates a knock-on risk for the professional HMO landlords who operate professional HMO when there's a lot of student out there, because it could. So all of these people are not really realising these risks at the moment from what I'm seeing on the street. They'll realise it when it hits them in the face, right? And so September or June, July, August, September, there might be some issues with student properties that aren't filled or people who don't want to fill them, and there'll be disposals, right? So I would say there'll be significant disposals. So if you've got a good way to repurpose them, right, for example, could be anything, could be short let, could be TA, could be all sorts of stuff. You might find there's plenty of stock out there to buy and not that many willing buyers because all the frictional costs have gone up because of the 5% stamp. There's a lot of other people just sitting and waiting. And every year there'll always be people who are waiting for this crash that is nowhere near happening, you know, because pricing is very reasonable. There's no bubble. So when there's no bubble, there's nothing to burst. You know, this is the thing. So those are sort of the two relatively seismic things I think will happen. But I absolutely advocate using your prop techs and all that to make your life easier, using your property filters, get your pipeline sorted, chase your pipeline up. The bread and butter still works. And you ultimately in a market where I think rents are up 7% this year, probably by the time we get to the end of the year. And I'm saying 5.5% for 2026. And then beyond that, it's going to settle down to in the 4% region for a couple of years. But while we've got enhanced inflation, that will continue. So yields are roaring, right? Because I don't think capital values will be up 7% this year. So you're buying into, and this is not a market we're used to. People say, oh, you got used to cheap debt and stuff like that. I always knew it was cheap. I just enjoyed it, right? Because it was good. I used as much of it as I could. Now we've got more expensive debt. You're having to take a different viewpoint and say, yeah, but we've got increasing yields. In the 2010s, all we had was decreasing yields because capital values went up faster than rents went up. Almost for the whole decade, almost everywhere. That had a big reversal because this is how the market reacts to the normalisation. Well, I can't afford it anymore. People are disposing of portfolios that were on base rate plus margin sort of thing. Shrinks the stock. What remains, and in terms of getting in terms of buying new property, and this is the thing that they've really damaged, because landlords talk about disposals all the time, but landlords talk a lot. There's a lot of people still with personal name portfolios, even though Section 24 was 2015. You'd think they probably would have done something about them by then, but they've done different things. They've mitigated. There's been issues with some of the tax schemes that you'll know about that have also then put people off doing things about various things, or thought, well, I always knew that was too good to be true. People throw the baby out with the bathwater, but people don't enter the market, and that's much more damaging. And that's what's been happening since all this negativity, vilification, I think it's a fair word to use when it comes to landlords.
But if you've got no more competition entering into the market, it's great for people like you.
Well, I'm probably one of the only people like me who does speak openly about that.
Yeah.
Because I think most people at a decent scale just shut up and get on with it. I think that's generally how business is done, which is why most people think if anyone sees a course, why are you selling it if you're so successful, sort of thing. Which, and look, if you had skepticism like that, you wouldn't be involved in these social housing loan schemes, for example. So I'm all for skepticism, you know.
So if because we've got listeners and watchers everywhere, so North, Midlands, South, we'll call it.
Yep.
So if I'm an investor in the North, the Midlands and the South, what if it were you up there in those three locations, what would you be targeting and what would you be doing? What
a fabulous question. So I think investors split themselves into two sorts, ones who will go a distance and ones who don't want to. And I've seen extreme examples of that where they won't go more than sort of 15-minute radius of home. And I get that, direct property investment takes effort. So your effort might not include getting in the car and driving miles and miles. But if you're in the South, you're struggling with a 6% interest rate. I don't think interest rates are going to come down a lot this year. Certainly not on mortgages. So I'm budgeting for that to be 5.5%, 6% to kind of be the number, right? And so that means gross yield of 7% on an average buy-to-let doesn't work because you're going to have 20% cost base minimum. If you don't, it means you're putting all that effort in yourself, which I advocate measuring and understanding what you're getting paid for your time. Because you're doing a job that otherwise an agent could do, at least understand that, So in the south, I think you've still got places you can go. Kent would, county-wise, Kent would be one, definitely. I go out to the West Swindon, that sort of way, depending on roughly where you are. If you're in Oxfordshire, you're in your Bistas, or you're a bit further out rather than your Oxford itself. So I've always invested suburban. So I'm going to say suburban because I think it's low risk profile. I think it's got good growth. That's my thing. I don't like city centre because it's easy to build a newer and bigger and shinier block of flats. It's very difficult to build a newer and bigger and better housing estate. In fact, what you find is they're in inferior locations. They're dead expensive and the roads are so thin you can't drive your car down there normally these days. But it does tend to put the price up in the area. So not a bad idea to buy secondary market stock near. So if you are someone who'd go further, going north is inevitable. You're being pushed there by the yield situation, right? And if you were going to do that, if you lived in the south, I would look at the infrastructure projects, right? And you're looking for stuff that's disproportionate to the area, not just talking about raw spend, but one of the things that led me to put some money up in Middlesbrough in 2023 when I was looking at 7% interest rates was, well, actually, there's 10% gross yields up here, but look at this infrastructure regeneration project. And then one of the things that I like is it's a hell of a lot cheaper to buy it than it would be to build it. So you've got the kind of rebuild cost insurance, and there's quite a few of the American guys that talk about that. That's been a cornerstone of what I've done from day one. I do like it as an insurance policy, if you like. If I was in the Midlands, you've got great options because you don't necessarily have to travel. I've, for years, preferred the East Midlands to the West Midlands, although the Costa del Stoke I do salute, and
of course,
and I have
always a great location.
A number of properties there, as you know, and I still think there's plenty of room in Stoke.
Yeah.
So depending on where you are, the Stokes of the world, but also, I'm at Derby rather than Nottingham because I squeeze the extra yield.
Yeah. Beware
the Derby HMO, I would say,
yes.
But the Derby block of flats or little conversion or whatever, I'd approach. There's lots and lots of providers who need properties around there, apart from anything else, plus your vanilla rental market. And wherever you're going, if you're providing units at the more affordable end of the spectrum, they're the people who are getting money pumped into their bank accounts with outsized minimum wage increases and the likes. Once we get to the 1st of April, if you've got 2 full-time minimum wage earners in a household, they're on 50 grand a year if they're putting in 40 hours a week.
Yeah.
50 grand household income, nearly enough for a mortgage, actually, as it goes, which is fantastic. Yeah. But it does mean people get fired more often and people invest in tech to take people out of jobs. Your Sainsbury's and Morrison's in the last few weeks are cutting loads of jobs on the back of that. So you do need to be a bit cautious, but it does support HMO. I just wouldn't do it somewhere where it's saturated necessarily. If you're already in the north, fantastic. The world's your oyster. Works really well. You've got tons of opportunity wherever you go. Northwest has grown a lot, but I still think it's got runway. Now, you can go quite expensive and therefore low yielding. So you still need to be careful. Just because it's the north doesn't mean it's cheap by any stretch of the imagination. But you can buy some huge lumps in some really nice locations. And again, you've got plenty of registered providers looking for stuff. And the northeast, well, those collar rents are being pushed up and up and up and up. And although we don't, magically the phrase levelling up just evaporated. Did you notice that a few months ago? Just evaporated. But there are infrastructure projects going in of a decent size, involving rail, involving all sorts of stuff. One more thing I might have missed out there, just going back to it's somewhere between the Midlands and the South. I'm not really sure where Bedfordshire counts as, really. Definitely the very South Midlands, very north of the South sort of thing.
North Londonshire.
No, very, very technical, very good. But there's going to be this big investment in the Oxford-Cambridge corridor, potentially this Universal Studios park that we think is happening, but we haven't had sign-off yet. All of that really affects Bedfordshire, which is absolutely the affordable one down by the home counties, right? So, there's this tiny little village, can't remember what its name is, begins with T, but it's going to get absolutely blown up by all of this stuff that's going on, and there's going to be housing estates all the way down that Oxford-Cambridge corridor over the next however many years it takes them to properly sort it out. So look for those, I hate the phrase gold mine areas, but I'm going to say it now because I've said it, but look for your gold mine areas and get stuck into them, but find a reason. I think people make a big mistake that they think you either get yield or you get capital growth. it's always been nonsense. And over the last few years, it's been proven to be completely inversely proportional because the money's all flowing out of the expensive where the rental figures don't stack up with a mortgage into the inexpensive, which rising tide lifts all boats. I think 40% of transactions in Middlesbrough were to let. So it's not like all around the country, and this is typical of the macro, you get down a level and then you find out. So you do need to be careful about saturation in areas like that as well, because if everybody's piling in, be a bit cautious and just keep your eye on that stuff.
Great words of wisdom. And I think you've given us a really good understanding, particularly at that macro level, but also at the micro level for investors about what people should be looking for in 2025. I'm curious about what you're looking forward to in 2025, but I want to ask it in a slightly different way. If we were sat here on the 31st of December, 25, and you were looking back and it had been a successful year for you, why would that have been?
So I would say I would have bought over 100 properties, right, in 2025, because I measure it by units, not because I think units necessarily matters, but it means that we've seen enough opportunities, we've been able to fund them, we've been able to deliver them. I don't go out and go, I must meet that target, because if the market does a 2022, late 22, early 23, I'm not going to deliver anything like that level of volume. But if I'm right about my predictions, I should also be cashing in on them. And we managed to beat that number last year. We should be able to beat it again. So that would be one. I think we wouldn't have had a major upset event. I mean, I'm not saying the media won't use the word crisis, because they will do one way or another to sell some papers, but not having had a major economic upset, just a bit of stability, which is one of the big Labour words at the moment, but they can't deliver it on global events because we're just not in control of enough stuff anymore. And I'd say I would have lost 15 kilos probably, which is probably where I should have started.
Well, you need the optimised entrepreneur.
I do, but I don't need property and poppadoms, which is disappointing because I love property and poppadoms.
I know.
So I'll have to go and just talk and not eat curry like that lady who said she came along and she didn't want to have the curry or whatever.
Apoplectic.
Well, I almost mentioned when you introduced Adam as a large property portfolio investor, I was just going to qualify where the comma was.
I did think the same myself.
I mean, the thing is, property and poppadoms has contributed to massive weight gain for me as well.
That's what I was also thinking. Yeah. But you're on a bit of a journey on that front, mate. So I wish you all the best with it. And it's all this is good inspirational stuff for those of us who spend too much time sitting on our backsides talking like me.
And I would just invite you to add in that a great year for all of us, and I include myself in this as well, by the way, 31st December, I will have had one of James's home-cooked curries. Because this is a passion project to James this year. He's actually making curries from scratch and sharing it with viewers as well.
How to make it.
So I want to be the recipient of one of the curries of the month.
So when are you starting the meal prep service, mate? Is that
I don't think it'll go down well. Certainly not with me and the kids.
I've watched some of your review videos and they're very discerning, so I trust your.
The rate the restaurant's going down very well, and I think the whole situation as a whole with property and poppadoms has been meteoric in its growth. I think we're hitting the notes everywhere. It's been positioned very well, and it's popular for a reason.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the most exciting thing in the space, and I said this. Knocking on 18 months ago now when we spoke about it. And it's been a pleasure to be, Stoke's first birthday, Stoke's second birthday. Yeah. I've got a date etched in the calendar. I'm obviously inviting myself there to that one.
Yeah, of course.
But yeah, it's been, and the people that you get in the room, that's the thing for me. That's how you gauge everything. Yeah. Who's engaging with it? And your hosts as well. Who are they? Why?
They're brilliant.
Great people.
We're very, very lucky, and we're attracting the right delegates, the right hosts. And it was all obviously down to my little session on Boardroom Club where we thrashed it all out. We put a plan in place, and I went and executed it last year, and it's gone very, very well.
This is classic James Rogers, ladies and gents. It's definitely not all down to that, but it was nice to be a small contributory part. And at the end of the day, you had to go away and do the work, mate, which you absolutely did. So.
Well, yeah, it's gone very well, but it's testament to the people that you surround yourself with and where you get your advice from.
It's like compliment tennis. I love it.
It is. But
this advertorial is now completely amazing.
Would you like to finish on anything. Have you got anything to add to what you've said?
So I think you need to be resilient to be in this game anyway, right? And this year is a year where will test your resilience. Even someone as relatively sure as, and I'm sure of myself, not because I'm arrogant, although that helps obviously, but I'm sure of myself because I'm well researched and I work hard to make sure that I am. But even me, September, October, when people were throwing all these properties at me, quite literally, I found myself asking myself, "You doing the right thing here?" Everybody wants out. That voice it's still there. That voice, that voice of doubt or whatever. And I pressed on through. I had a really good think about it, and I sort of pressed on through it. And this year, there's so many people who don't understand the renters' rights implications yet, and we're nearly there. So we kind of know what they are. The student stuff that I talked about. But there'll be poison. The articles in the media are going to have a field day. There'll be the old gravestone, buy-to-let is dead. We're going to see the whole wheels roll out again and again, all the boring stuff, but with a bit more reason to do so. Whereas, like you kind of alluded to earlier, to the victors or to the survivors will go the spoils here. That much is absolutely guaranteed because of the way that economics works, apart from anything else. So be resilient, ignore the press, and go and find the facts out in general, and there'll always be an edge. And probably the only other thing I'd say is quality, right? And don't confuse quality with gold taps necessarily. Quality in your market will insulate you from risks that pop up, right? I remember I did a 1-week intensive plastering course in 2012, and I plastered my first refurb myself, over-plastered it, right, plastered under the stairs, polished it till it was like glass. I had the little terrible plasterer, right? I knew I was a terrible plasterer after that.
Looked like it had been thrown on with a catapult.
Well, the amount of time, what really, I did a half-decent job. The problem was it took 12 times as long as it would have taken a proper plasterer, right? And then I learned that I didn't want to be a plasterer quite easily. Not that I thought I did, but I just wanted to know more about the trades, project management, all of that sort of stuff. And I showed first viewings that we did, showed these people around, and they came in through the front door, right? And do you know what they said? They said, "Oh, isn't it clean?" And I just thought, you absolute donut, under the stairs with the hawk and the trowel, doing all this. And all it needed to be good quality in 2012 in that market, in Nuneaton in Warwickshire, where it was to be bloody clean.
Yeah.
Right. And that put it in the top 25% of rental stock. But I learned a lesson that day and thought, right, appropriate. Because if you try and be in the top 5%, you might find yourself spending money that you don't get back.
Yeah.
And the problem is if you race to the very top, it gets difficult because someone who's a better interior designer than you or someone who's a better this or that than you will have an edge over you. Whereas if you just look at the rest of the market and say, right, I want to try and be top quartile. Enough. Exactly. In Stoke, that looks different to Mayfair. Yeah. No offence to either place.
Of course, absolutely. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there. What an episode.
Yeah.
Absolutely amazing.
Absolutely brilliant. Some real gems there, Adam. So thank you for sharing all of your wisdom. And what you said about the media, I think that's so important that people read all this stuff, and what it does, it starts to form our cognitive bias to find ways to reinforce what we've heard.
So true.
And just a very quick tip on that. When you read something in the media that is fear-mongering, remember two things. The first thing is, what if the exact opposite is true? If you believe the exact opposite is true, you'll find ways to have a bias towards information that tells you that it's not true. And the second thing is action drives away fear. Yeah. We've got to act, we've got to decide what we're going to do, and we've got to just take action. And you're an incredible role model to everyone to do that, Adam. So thank you very much.
Well, I appreciate that very much. Thank you, and thank you both for having me on. Enjoyed it a lot.
That's it from us at Let's Chat. Adam Lawrence, brilliant investor, exceptional chap, and come and join us at a Property and Propenomix meeting. Search for us on the website. We've got 35 live locations. We've got 3 online meetings now. We hope to see you at a meeting very soon.
And we'll see you on the next podcast.
Okay, let's chat with James and Luke.